Rusty, I was in a meeting one time put on by our denomination, and a guy I was leading a panel. One of the guys on the panel, about 70, 80 pastors in the room, staff members, pastors. He said, "How many of you have been discipled?" And less than a third of the hands went up. And I just sat there just stunned, thinking, this is our problem, man. Is it if we don't have pastors that have been discipled, we're not going to have churches that are making disciples.
Hey, welcome to Simple Faith. My name's Rusty George. Honored to have you with us. Today, we get a chance to have a conversation with a new friend, a guy by the name of Ken Adams, who's a pastor of a church called Crossroads out of Georgia. And he has some incredible insight and resources when it comes to personal discipleship. Now, I know some of you are a little bit more wired to, I just want to grow in my faith, deepen my faith. I like to study. I like to learn. And you actually like kind of systems and processes to help you get there. And some of the rest of you are more like, yeah, I want to grow in my faith, but I like to just kind of practically work that out on my own with Jesus by my side. Well, Ken is going to provide us some great information today that I think you're really going to enjoy. And here's what I want to ask you to do as we listen to this. Be thinking of who you want to share this with, because I want you to forward this particular podcast to somebody. Maybe even decide to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. But I think by the time we're done, you're going to want to order some of Ken's materials, because I know I did as well. So here's my conversation with Ken Adams. Here we go. Well, Ken Adams, it is great to have you on the podcast. Great to meet you. We have a mutual friend in Kevin Burrell. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of where you come from, where you live, how you met Kevin, all those kind of things.
Yeah, that's great, man. It's exciting to be with you. And so I pastor a church called Crossroads Church. We're in a place called Noonan, Georgia, and I'm homegrown. I'm from the Atlanta area, born here, grew up here, been serving here for a while, went through Georgia State University to get my bachelor's degree, started teaching and coaching, and God said, that's not really what I got you here for. And so ended up knowing that meant doing ministry in some way. Didn't really want to pastor a church. Actually, I tell people, Rusty, three things I didn't want to do. And I told God, I said, I'll go to seminary under three conditions, right? So not a good thing to do with God. But I said, number one, I don't want to be a lead pastor. Number two, I don't want to be in a Baptist church. And number three, I don't want to be in the South. And so guess what I've been doing for 35 years, man? I have been a lead pastor in a Baptist church in the South. And it's been fantastic. It's been, honestly, it's been the ride of a lifetime. And so I went to Southwestern Seminary out there, probably somewhere near you. And then I came back here, planted a church in 1989 called Crossroads Church. And we've been just swinging at it ever since. And I know we'll talk about this some, but one of the things that we set out to do early on is we just felt like the church needed to get back to what Jesus really started it to be, and that was really more of a movement of multiplying disciples. And so that's what we've been at really for the last 35 years. We wouldn't say that we're a movement, but we are making some progress in disciple making, and so we're doing that. And I connected with Kevin. Man, I don't know, probably 20-something years ago, he showed up at our church just like a lot of other people. And we hit it off and just kind of with our sports background. And he served on our staff for a little while. We've done a lot through FCA and ministry together. Now we do a little ministry here called Impact Ministries. Kevin's a part of that, helping us take disciple making into the athletic arena. So that's kind of our history and our background, and even how Kevin and I got connected. So,
for almost half a century, GNPI has been creating media and sharing Jesus. From solar kits to social media, the gospel message has been on the move around the world. Because of people like you, The ministry is now 27 teams strong in 16 countries. And with the inauguration of Nomad Academy, a new generation of media makers receive training to create media and share the good news. In India, Hindi Church Online reaches hundreds of thousands of viewers per week. Projects like The Global Gospel and Amazing Stories connect with children and adults alike in their own heart languages. In fact, GNPI teams engaged over 66 million with the good news last year. But with billions still waiting, we must do more. So, where do we go from here? Mission 15. This movement will send 1 billion gospel invitations by the end of 2030. It's going to take all of us to reach this goal. What can you do? It's easy. Simply pray, share, and give. You can pray for 15 minutes that people around the world will hear the good news. You can share your faith 15 times with others. Invite them to your small group or church. You can give $15 one time or monthly. With every $15 given, 450 gospel invitations will go out. Just imagine the impact you could have over a year when you pray, share, and give. By the power of the Holy Spirit and your partnership, we at GNPI believe this audacious goal is attainable, to send 1 billion invitations to follow Jesus by the end of 2030. Will you join the movement?
Anybody connected with Kevin obviously has a passion for sports. And obviously we spoke off the air just a little bit about your desire to break into that as well when you were a high schooler and collegiate level like we all had. Tell me, what do we learn from sports and that really kind of correlates with disciple making when you kind of put those two things together? Because just listening to you talk, I would assume that you connect really well with guys. Guys connect really well with sports. Becomes a great metaphor. The Apostle Paul used it as a metaphor. How do you bridge those two worlds?
Well, probably a lot of things we could say about that, but I think probably, I'm a lot of times I've connected through Fellowship of Christian Athletes has been a venue that I've been a part of. And so really it's just kind of all like everything else. It just kind of comes out of who we are and what we do. And so, I've told people for years that growing up, I was usually at one of three places. I was either at home, at church, or on a ball field somewhere. And so it isn't something that I set out to figure out how to do. I wasn't trying to come up with a strategy to connect with people, but basically out of a whole lifetime of being in a field, a court, a gym, working out, playing, whatever, I've just kind of become a part of who I am. And then when you know that God's called us here to really, make disciples that make disciples, then those two worlds connect. And so I've been involved in speaking to athletes a lot. And then here recently through Impact, we've developed some resources that we try to help go into campuses, go into schools, and help really start movements of multiplying disciples. And I would add this too, maybe just to tie into your question. So I believe this, Rusty, that, first of all, is that if I'm going to be the best athlete that I can be, then I have to be the best person that I can be. And if I'm going to be the best person that I can be, then I've got to have God in the center of that. And I've got to know what that means to really growing in him. And then as a result of that, how does he use me to influence others? And, you know this, but I'll tell you today, in today's world, a high school, college coach has about as much influence as any youth pastor or even pastor does. Yeah. And so, Amen. How you don't connect those two is the question, right?
Right. So, that's a great point. That's a great point. Okay, so I got to ask you this. Noonan, Georgia. The only person I've ever met from Noonan, Georgia is, and maybe she's the claim to fame of Noonan, Georgia, the Bachelorette, Deanna Pappas. Ring a bell?
I think I've heard that.
Okay.
I think I've heard that.
She went to our church in California. I did her wedding, and so that's the only time I'd ever heard the phrase Noonan, Georgia. So gotcha. I just need to clear that up.
But let me tell you this, man, because we got a section of highway right here, section of interstate that is called Allen Jackson Highway.
Wow. Okay.
So Allen Jackson is from Noonan, Georgia.
Is that down there by the Chattahoochee?
Way down yonder on the Chattahoochee, never knew how much that muddy water meant to me, but I learned how to swim.
You know what? The Chattahoochee runs right by our county. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Way down yonder. Awesome. Okay. Well, we got that cleared up. Let's dive into the important stuff. Disciple making. Okay. So let me just take it from this angle. Every church says they're making disciples.
That's right.
And every church should be making disciples.
That's right.
But how would you define what a disciple is? And then secondly, what was the gap that you saw that you felt like, I don't know if we're doing that right. We need to fill that gap to make disciples that make disciples.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome, man. Great question. So let me say this. Let me start by saying this, because you're dead on, man, when you say every church in the world would tell you that they're making disciples. That's such a buzzword today.
Right.
But let me tell you this, Rusty. We've found there's a huge difference between a church with discipleship and a church that's a disciple-making church.
Yeah.
Because a church with discipleship is a church that sees it almost as a program.
Yep.
That it's really just more like Christian education, and it's an add-on to everything else you do.
Mm-hmm.
So we like to think of our church as a disciple-making church, and that means it's not a part of what we do, it's all we do. So we're committed to helping people become what we call fully trained disciples from before they even step foot into our church till they become a leader or another disciple maker in our church. We see that as not just a part of what we do, but it's what we exist for. We exist to be a church that's making disciples that make disciples, and that's what we call fully trained. So when you ask how do we define it, well, the shorter answer is we don't, but Jesus does. And here's what's really cool is that in Luke chapter 6, so Rusty, everybody knows Matthew 28, right? Go make disciples of all nations. But if you ask most pastors, you say, what does it look like when you make one? They don't know. They don't know what it looks like. But Luke chapter 6, verse 40, man, I think it's just as important as Matthew 28. And that Jesus says a disciple, a student looks like his master. When he is fully trained, he will look like his master. A student is not above his master, but when he is fully trained, he will look like his master. So what we ought to be doing is we ought to be developing disciples that have two things. They have Christ-like character, Christ-like conduct. And because that's how you describe everybody, right? If I were telling somebody, I mean, you and I just met, but if I were telling somebody about you, I would describe you in two ways: by your character, who you are, and your conduct, what you do. And so, and I would just add this, that I think Christ-like character and conduct is not something that is subjective, but it is objective. And we can actually measure whether or not we're making fully trained disciples. I grew up in churches that we made partially trained disciples, not necessarily fully trained disciples.
Right.
So I know I'm dumping the load.
No, that's great. And I think that churches have been guilty of creating busy disciples.
Big time.
That are just involved in a lot of programs and Bible studies. And I mean, when you think about it, the resources that our Christians have today are way more than the disciples ever had. They never had a commentary, a podcast, a website, not even the fully formed Bible. And we're just filling up our schedule with more and more and more of that stuff rather than just living it out. Wouldn't you say?
Man, Rusty, I'm sitting here in my study, and you got all these books on here that I don't even read, and check this out, man. Is it all that I have in this study is on my phone right now? Yeah, exactly. I have access to tons of podcasts, tons of sermons, even Bible study apps that would fill this library and then some,
Yeah.
you know?
You'll know the name J.I. Packer, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this guy was the Michael Jordan of theologians. Wrote the one of the greatest books ever written called Knowing God. I mean, this dude, he'd walked around God and taken pictures. I mean, he knew. And my buddy Randy Frazee, who was down in Texas for years, and Randy, he had J.I. come in for some conference they were doing, and they were working together on creating this basically an assessment of discipleship. And Packer says to him, "You know what, you people in Texas, what your problem is?" And he said, "What's that?" And he said, "You all study the Bible too much." And this is J.I. Packer. And Randy says, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "You're constantly in Bible studies, but you have no dirt under your nails from working with the poor."
Wow.
I thought, oh man, that wrecked me.
Wow.
And I think that's kind of the missing piece, don't you think, of, and this is what Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, hearing the word of God and doing it is what makes you have have a stable life. And I think we hear a lot, but we don't do much.
That's so true. And it's funny you bring that up. I was just in an impact group, what we call our discipleship groups. We call them impact groups. I was in a group this morning with about 7 or 8 guys, and we were just talking about the way Jesus made disciples. And if you look at his life and you look at what he did, so he gave his disciples 4 things. He gave them content, which means he gave them truth. He gave them contact, which means he gave them relationship. They did things together, traveled together, hung out together, fished together, laughed together, all that. But then he also gave them context. And context was that he took them, this is cool. He called them to be fishers of men, but then he took them on fishing trips. And he took, when he went to Matthew's house or Levi, whichever, version you're reading, when he goes to Levi's house, there's a little phrase in there that says, and he was hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, and his disciples were with him. And I tell you, Rusty, that was strategic, right? He took those guys so that they could see how he interacted with people far from God. And and you know what? I told my guys this morning, I said, we do a lot of fellowship, we do a lot of study, but we don't do much context together. And that's what we got to work on.
Did you know that there's more than 6 billion people who do not know Jesus, don't have a relationship with him? 3 billion that don't even know his name, haven't even heard of him. Good News Productions International is working to solve that problem. GNPI has been working for decades now to help use media to help people come to know and find and follow Jesus. You can check out more from gnpi.org, but you can also go and be a part of their bold initiative to share the gospel over 1 billion times in the next few years. Check out mission15.global or go to gnpi.org. I'm going to ask you to sign up through mission15.global and pledge $15 a month. That's like a latte or two in order to help people come to know Jesus globally. The work they do is incredible, and you're going to want to hear all about it on our podcast with Mike Schrage. So check that out, and check out GNPI and the work they're doing, mission15.global, and be a part of it today. Oh man, you're getting me going here on this. It's one of my favorite passages in Scripture where Jesus goes to Matthew's house. And I love that he takes the disciples to see all that. And those good Jewish boys must have just been so shocked at seeing Jesus hanging out by the jukebox, with a plate of hot wings. But here he is hanging out with this guy. And when Matthew writes that down in his gospel, he uses a Greek word for eating together. He doesn't use again until the Last Supper. And I just think that's so fascinating that he contextualized as close as Jesus was to us on the night before he was crucified is just as close in context to those unchurched people, non-Christians, people far from God in that moment. And that's just that's just such a great thing that we see in him. And we often, and you know, when we're always at church and Bible studies where it's a little hard to do.
Yeah. I love that, man. That's good stuff right there.
Okay. I want to walk through some of your resources because you've got some great stuff. And I jotted down some of the names of your books and I was so compelled by them. But you talk about, you know, these different seasons. And the one of them is the first 30 days to becoming a disciple-making church. And then the other one is the first 30 days to becoming a disciple-making pastor. Tell us a little bit about what these resources provide.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would just say this, that all of the resources that we've developed actually have just come out of the overflow of what we've been doing. So all of them are the result of, you know, I tell people I've been in the trenches, same church, same place for 35 years, just trying to crank it out and just trying to figure out how to do this thing called disciple making. So, you know, kind of like you, I'm in a season of life where, you know, I feel like God's calling me to share what I've experienced and what I've learned. And you do learn a thing or two after 35 years, you know, in the same place. And so one of the things that we've figured out, or I won't say figured out, but one of the things that we are learning is that there are certain things about a disciple-making church that you see in the life of Christ that he did because Jesus came to start a movement which is called Christianity, and it is the church, right? And so what we did in the 30 Days book is you can't become a disciple-making church in 30 days, but you can get a little bit of a taste of it and maybe an appetizer. So 30 days to a disciple maker is great for a staff to work through. It's a very easy read. It's great to take a team in your church through. It's a great way to train up some leaders, and it's just a primer, kind of a like I said, appetizer. Disciple making pastor. So here's what's happened with that. I came to the conclusion a few years ago that if the pastor's not leading the charge, man, it ain't going to happen. And Rusty, I was in a meeting one time put on by our denomination, and a guy was leading a panel. One of the guys on the panel, about 70, 80 pastors in the room, staff members, pastors. He said, "How many of you have been discipled?" And less than a third of the hands went up. And I just sat there just stunned, thinking, this is our problem, man. Is it if we don't have pastors that have been discipled, we're not going to have churches that are making disciples. And so I actually started an equipping group, I call it. It's an online equipping group, kicking one off in January. And it's where pastors can come and we look at the life of Christ through 6 priorities of a disciple-making pastor. And the 30-day book is just an introduction to that. And it's something that pastors can read through quickly, and then hopefully they'll take another step and get more involved in some training for that.
That's really good. Well, for your just like a lay leader out there, just, you know, Joe Christian sitting in the pew, what resource would you recommend for them to just start getting their mind wrapped around this? And what does this look like, you know, with their neighbors, with their coworkers, even with their family, to be a disciple maker? Where would you send them for that?
Well, I do think the disciple-making church, 30 days to a disciple-making church is good for anybody. It's not just for a pastor. It's not just for a leader. It's really for anybody. And then, you know, ultimately what we want to see people do is we want to see people, you know, start where they are, find a handful of people that are, you know, hungry to know more, hungry to grow, and then start them on a process of sort of laying a foundation, developing, you know, God, Christ-like character, Christ-like conduct. That's what we do in these impact groups. And so, so, you know, if they sort of cruise around our website, they'll see lots of podcast blogs, materials. I mean, it's hard for me to say this is where I would send them, but I would say either the disciple-making church or just going ahead and getting an impact resource and finding a group of people and start pouring your life into them. It started for me back before I was even on staff in a church. I had actually spoken at a beach retreat, and I had about 6 guys that really either came to know Christ or got recommitted to Christ. And they were in a traditional kind of a small dying church, and I couldn't just let them go back to that. So I invited them over to my house, and I was still living at home at the time. And we met in the basement of my parents' house. And for about a year, we just opened God's word, challenged each other, held each other accountable. And I watched these guys' lives transform. And funny thing is, Rusty, I'd never been discipled, didn't know anything about discipleship, wasn't in ministry, wasn't planning on going in ministry per se. And I just realized after that experience, I'd do this the rest of my life. And
Wow.
And that's where it started. And the cool thing is, 2 of those guys end up in full-time ministry. One of them becomes an elder in a church that we started at some point. I mean, it's really cool because I saw firsthand the power of doing what Jesus told us to do.
That's amazing. Well, Ken, tell us your website where people can find you and get these great resources and kind of figure out what's next for them. There's a lot of good stuff there. There's a book called Fully Trained Disciples, The Power of Multiplication, Next Steps, Disciple Making Metrics, which would be great for a lot of pastors and churches. So where can they find you?
Yeah, so just go to impactdisciples.com, impactdisciples.com. We also have a podcast called the Disciple Making Church Podcast. One of the things that we've done for the entire history of our church is we always, our ministry year starts in basically August with the school year. And so we set aside a week every summer to just really try to do nothing else but just come together and pray. Mm-hmm. We do it early in the morning, we do it at night, and we just set that aside as a priority because we do believe that this is a value that we need to hold to. You can check that out. And I would just say come check out the website. It'll give you lots of information. We have something coming up in January called the Disciple Making Summit, and it's a conference that we do every year. We've been doing it now. This will be our 5th year, and it's funny, man. Years ago, I used to go to this thing called the Leadership Summit. Yeah, and here's the funny thing, Rusty. I would always walk away going, I believe the best leaders come out of leadership, comes out of discipleship. And so I always used to think, well, why is it there a conference called the Discipleship Summit? And so after that, there actually were some conferences, but they've sort of dropped off. And so we said, well, it's time to start one. We really did this for our own church, but now we've got a lot of people coming from outside of our church, and it's a Friday night, Saturday. Mm-hmm. We got some great guys coming. A guy named, you might know these guys, a guy named Dan Spader, a guy named Mark Danzy, and a guy named Mac Lake will be there.
Love Mac Lake. Yeah, he's been a guest on the show.
Has he?
Yeah.
So they'll all be speaking at our summit January. No, it's the last weekend. It's February the 1st, I think, and January 31st, something like that.
Okay. That's great.
It's on the website.
That's great. Okay. Well, I want to send everybody to your website, have them pick up some resources and maybe even attend the summit. That would be fantastic. A lot of our church planners that listen to this would be a great resource for them as they're kind of building out their disciple-making strategy, which tends to be the last thing we think of. The first thing is how do we get people in the door and how do we get them to pay the bills, basically, is the way we think. And, kind of changing our thinking there would be such a huge step for all of our churches. So, Ken, it is great to meet you. You lived up to the hype that Kevin Burrell gave you, which is hard to do because he's a great hype man. But man, I really appreciate you being on the show and becoming a new friend of Simple Faith. So thank you for your time.
You bet, Rusty. Thanks a lot, man. Lord bless you, brother.
You as well. That was great stuff with my new buddy, Ken Adams. Hope you got something out of that. Want to make sure you go to his website and order some of those products. They're going to be really, really helpful for you, especially as we get closer to the new year, and you can dive into those. Hey, we're back next week with brand new content. Can't wait for you to be a part of that. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure that you share this. If you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, check it out there because our producer does a great job of doing a lot of add-ins here and there. Video clips, bloopers, various things like that. So check us out on YouTube. Okay, we will talk to you next week on Simple Faith. And as always, keep it simple.